was born in the Northern California.
Yeah, thanks so much for making this happen today. I really appreciate it. I wanted to just start by giving an introduction of, first of all, it's really cool to be talking to you because I got into cycling in 1979 when Breaking Away came out. That got a whole generation of young people like me into cycling.
Well, how old were you then?
I was, 79, I would have been 12.
Okay.
So by the time the early 80s rolled around, I'd been increasingly into cycling, and I remember seeing an article about RAAM, and you were my first cycling hero. I was this guy doing this incredible ride across the United States. It just sounded so cool, and just reading about the grueling intensity of that effort, just captured my imagination along with a lot of other people. And yeah, you were my first cycling hero. I need to find it again because I recently ran across this paper I wrote about you for school, Lon Haldeman, the man in the myth, or something like that. It was for school. So that was really cool so it's especially cool to be talking to you. And I wanted to add what prompted me to reach out. I was last week, I was flipping through an old photo album that I've had literally since the 80s. I had a whole bunch of old cycling stuff in there. And I saw this card, my old St. Louis Cycling Club membership card from 1983 that has been behind the plastic in this photo album since 1983. I don't know what prompted me to peel that thing open and take out a bunch of these old cards and my old bike USCF racing licenses and look at them. But when I pulled this one out, I turned it over, and for all those years, I had your autograph in there. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I wonder whatever happened to Lon Haldeman. And I looked up and saw you're still doing all this cycling stuff. And I don't even remember where I got that. I think I remember seeing Sue at the Carondelet bike racing series. I don't know if you were there and I got your autograph, or but
yeah. Susan remembers that. That's one of the few races that she actually did in St. Louis.
Okay.
It was like a spring race, I believe, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah, it was a series of 3 races over like 3 Saturdays, or I think it was 3 Saturdays or 3 Sundays in a row. Mm-hmm. There was a whole series of crits around Carondelet Park. It was super cool. So that was my first criterium race. So and yeah, I remember Sue being there in the women's race.
That's neat.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. So anyway, so it's super exciting for me to be talking to you and catching up about all your accomplishments all these years later. So I think I wanted to start by, I always like starting like hearing about what was your first memory of a bicycle?
Well, I remember I got a coaster brake 1-speed bike from the hardware store in town, and it was a Hiawatha, and I think they got it from like the Coast to Coast. Yeah, that's ironic. The Coast to Coast hardware store, which I don't think those are even in business anymore. But it was like $59. And my parents said that was a lot of money for a bike, so we're going to make sure you can grow into it. And so I was about 8 years old. I could barely stand over the bike, definitely not stand over it. I could barely get on it by jumping off the porch steps and riding around. And when I had to get off, I had to dismount and jump off at the same time. And so I rode that and eventually started riding to school, which is about 10 blocks. And I thought that was a really long way to ride a bike. Little by little, I started going out of town. And where I lived there in northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, was a perfect grid work of back roads, 1 mile farm road, 1 mile grid of farm roads. So it was very safe to ride. You might see a tractor out there or something, but hardly any traffic. And so I was able to, go exploring. 3 miles was a long way. Eventually, there was a town 10 miles away with an ice cream shop. And I rode up there and back. That was like a really long day. And eventually longer rides around Lake Geneva, which is about a 50-mile round trip. I remember I got up and started at 6 in the morning thinking it was going to take all day. Well, I was back by early afternoon. It was still a 7-hour ride for me. But,
Wow, that's
so like every month I would ride like another 10-mile all-time distance, so it was a gradual progression. And I think it was probably sometime when I was in my early teens that I finally rode 100 miles. And by that time I had, my grandfather actually found this junker bike, Raleigh Hercules, without shift cables. It was, at the time, it would have been considered an English racer, but it didn't have shift cables, didn't have brake shoes, didn't have, brakes or anything on it. And so I got that kind of to work. I actually put a coaster brake rear wheel in it, and I would ride that around on my longer rides. And I didn't really have any really good equipment at that time. So I remember like wearing out the rear tire and putting duct tape around the tire and the rim, to patch my tire because I had scuffed through it. And so it didn't have rim brakes or anything. So it was just kind of a bump kind of a ride. But that's kind of how I started. I finally got a bike with shift cables and started riding a 10-speed bike, which I thought was really neat. And, so I think that's when I did my first 100-mile ride.
Wow. So what age was that?
I was probably an early teenager then. Sometime maybe freshman in high school. So it was like I was probably 13, 14 years old at the time.
Wow. So you were putting in long distances really early on.
Well, and at that time, and that time in my life or that area, riding 100 miles was, that was considered, odd, and they had a bike-a-thon in town for Diabetes Association. I did like 60 miles one year. The next year I did like 120 or something, and people thought that was amazing. But, little did I know, if I had gone to Chicago or any of these bigger towns, riding 100 miles, I had good riders all the time doing that. But I was in a very desolate area and, didn't have much interaction with good riders. And I remember one day being downtown, a town of 5,000 people. And anyway, some other riders came into town. They had black shorts and cleated shoes and racing bikes. And I started talking to them. I was, mid-teenager at that time. And I said, well, why do you have black shorts? And they explained. Why do you have cleats on your shoes? And they explained, oh, this is back when you nailed the cleats on. And, because they had stiff sole shoes and things. And so I went home and I got some black dress pants and I cut them off and I made black cycling shorts. And then I traced some sheet metal on my soles of my shoes. And, I put the sheet metal inside my tennis shoes to stiffen up the soles of my shoes. And so those are my cycling shoes. And didn't really wear helmets back then in the early 70s, but so little by little I learned a little bit more, but a lot of stuff I learned was just by trial and error because I didn't really have any cycling mentors that I really could relate to, locally anyway.
Right. Yeah. So, and then how did that advance into, later getting into what was the next step as you started getting serious? Did you join a team or?
Well, yeah, I started dabbling with, I think Bicycling Magazine, Rodale Press came out in like the early 70s. I'm trying to think, maybe 1972 or so. And so I joined this Rockford Bicycle Club, Rockford, Illinois. And somebody gave me a whole bunch of back issues of Bicycling Magazine. So I just devoured that, learned as much as I could about nutrition and everything. So that's really what started in learning what was practical, what was possible. And I liked going places on my bike. So I started doing these longer rides, now I'm, later in high school and even after high school, I wasn't playing sports anymore. So I got interested in riding 200-mile days, and then eventually a 300-mile, eventually a 400-mile, 24-hour ride. And one of the rides I did actually started up by Lake Superior, northern Wisconsin, and it was 407 miles back down to Illinois. And I did that as like an overnight, all day, all night ride. I did it in 23 hours, 7 minutes for the 407 miles. And, I thought all that was, world class at the time. Well, there's a lot of riders in England and stuff that were doing over 400 all the time. But anyway, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the point to point type of thing. And so I started doing more events like that, where we'd, go down, ride from northern Illinois down to St. Louis, 300 miles, do a 300-mile race the next day, and then ride back 300 miles the next day. So over 900 miles in 3 days. And, that was really good training for the cross-country rides. And so I had started following the history and devouring all the information I could find about transcontinental racing. And just to give you a little background on that, Thomas Stevens in the 1870s crossed the country from San Francisco back to New York in a little over 100 days on a penny farthing, a high wheel bicycle. And he was riding about 35 miles a day or so on roads that there really was no road. They had just completed the Transcontinental Railroad across. And so he's like following, on the shoulder of the railroad tracks. And anybody that's ridden a modern mountain bike knows, 35 miles a day on bushwhacking is a long way to go. Well, he's doing it on a penny farthing, with a 5-foot diameter wheel with 1-inch wide tire. And so anyway, he gets across the country in a little over 100 days. He continues on to England and then around the world, and he ended up writing his book. Well, a few years later, a guy named George Nellis reads the book, says, "Oh, I'd like to race across the country too." So George goes into it, starting the other way, going from New York back to San Francisco, and he's a little more intent on setting a record. Now, Thomas Stevens, he was still doing it as a tour. He had stayover days and things like that. Well, George Nellis, a little more focused, and George ended up doing it in a little over 70 days. So he knocked about 30 days off the record. Well, so now in the 1880s, 1890s, the high wheel bikes kind of phased out. They brought in the safety bikes, which are, bicycles with the wheels the same size. That made it a whole lot better. A lot of these are still one-speed direct drive, track bike kind of things without good brakes or anything. But people started riding it across the country, and every 10 years somebody'd knock, another 10 days off the record. And so in 1943, a guy named Jack Russell, like the dog, Jack Russell went to southern United States from San Diego to like Jacksonville, Florida. It was 2,700 miles in 27 days. So he was the first guy to average 100 miles a day across the country. And that was, again, considered, humanly impossible at the time. Well, in the 1960s, Peter Duker from England crossed the country in 18 days. He was sponsored by a taxi cab company. So I don't know if he had like a yellow taxi following him or something, but he did it in around 18 days. And then in the early 70s, Paul Cornish did it in 13 and a half days. And that was a route that went from Santa Monica to New York City. So that kind of became a traditional route, is to go from Santa Monica to New York City. And, the 38th parallel of the United States kind of goes from like Denver, Wichita, St. Louis. So if you cross the 38th parallel sometime across the country, you're pretty much guaranteed about a 3,000-mile route. You can't just shortcut it and go San Diego to Jacksonville, or go, Seattle to Boston, which would be closer to probably to 3,400 miles. But anyway, so Paul Cornish sets the record. A few years later, John Marino in 1978 wants to set a cross-country record. So he does it in 13 days, 5 hours or so. It broke Paul Cornish's record just by a few hours. And then John Marino. And so I'm following all of this little bits and pieces in Bicycling Magazine, the Paul Cornish's record and John Marino's record, and I'm reading these stories, and I'm thinking, oh boy, I'd love to do that again someday. So I'm in the back of my mind, that's what I'm kind of planning for. I had no idea how to do it, but I thought I'd like to try it. And so I started doing these longer 300 and 400 mile multi-day events, which turned out to be pretty good training, because it wasn't just the watts of power on the bicycle. It was dealing with all the adversity that you find in the open country. You're dealing with traffic, you're dealing with weather, you're dealing with mountains and roads, and trying to even find a route. This is before there were Google Maps. You're looking at a state AAA map, putting a magic marker line on it and saying, oh yeah, I think I'm going to try to, go from, Indianapolis to Wichita or something, and find the best way. So in 1980, John Marino did it in 12 days, 3 hours. And that was really at the point I said, I'm going to get serious and try to break his record. So I was planned, and I had been planning this now for 10 years, little by little, but finally we came up with a date that I'm actually going to start. So 1981, we're planning how to break the cross-country record. The record was 12 days, 3 hours by John Marino. And so we're planning, making all the routes and all the contacts. My dad's writing, dozens of letters to all the highway departments about trying to get clearances and things. And one night I'm riding the rollers, and my dad says, well, okay, we got this all figured out. And I said, well, if we've done all this work, why don't we try to break the double transcontinental record and go from New York to Los Angeles and back to New York? And at that time, the record was 36 days. That was set by Victor Vincenti about 10 years earlier. And so I said, I don't know if 36 days, I think I can do it in 28. But on the return trip, we're going to try to break John Marino's record also. So in a period of about 5 minutes, we made totally change of plans. And I said, okay, we're going to try to break this double transcontinental record and the single transcontinental record. And that's going to be starting in June of 1981. So that's kind of how I finally had a definite plan of racing across the country fast.
Wow. So now were you trying to break the record both directions, single?
Well, as it turned out, had I broke the record going east to west, that would have been great. But it turned out I did it in 12 days, 18 hours. So I did not break John Marino's record of 12 days, 3 hours. We got to Santa Monica late in the afternoon, just before sundown. And we had just ridden through 150 miles of stop and go traffic lights. And I knew if we had to get back out of Los Angeles early, just after 3 o'clock the next morning. So we basically went to bed, had about 4 hours of sleep, got back up at 3 a.m, left Los Angeles. Now all the traffic lights are at least flashing yellow in the middle of the night. So I got back out of there. So, and the clock is still running, for the double transcontinental record. So we on our way back, and we're a little, now we had learned a lot. I'd ridden, from New York to Los Angeles, just about diet, about sleeping, about logistics, about the route and everything. So the return trip went a whole lot smoother. We knew the roads. My diet had got a lot more refined. I was eating more on the bike, and I was actually riding more into the night. On the east-west record, we didn't really ride at night. I thought, oh, well, if you knock out 225 miles during daylight hours from 6 a.m. to, sundown, that was a pretty good day. But on the return trip, I started riding a little bit longer into the night and, trying to pack in another 30, 40 miles every day. So it turned out that on the return trip, we're counting it down, didn't know if I was on schedule or not, but over the last 500 miles, we're still anticipating, are we on schedule or not? And as we're coming into the final 100 miles into the Holland Tunnel into New York City, we had made arrangements that I had clearance to go through the Holland Tunnel, which nowadays that'd be impossible after 9/11. They would never let you do that. But they said, okay, if you get here, by 6 in the morning, you can get through. Now this is midnight, and I got 100 miles to go. And, I'm going through Eastern Pennsylvania, I'm going pretty good pace. I'm with some editors of Bicycling Magazine that came out to meet me. And we get word back. They said, oh, no, you got to be here before 5 o'clock in the morning. So that meant my average speed had to be well above 20 miles an hour. Now, we get this word like at 3 in the morning. And I got 2 hours to go and 50 miles. So I kind of really put the hammer down, time trialed all the way in. We get there a little after 5 a.m. They let us go through Holland Tunnel, come out the other side, finish at New York City Hall. And my time was 10 days, 23 hours, which knocked about a day off the record. So at that point, I was like, oh, I had completed all my goals. We broke the double transcontinental and the single transcontinental record. And I figured my cycling career was pretty much over. I had done everything I had planned to do. So
wow, that's incredible. Can you take us like through a day, like what were those days like of being? I mean, you're obviously you're trying to keep a certain pace, and just can you talk through like typical days, what some of the challenges were, and just how you kept that kind of pace for that long?
yeah, well, something that I don't know if people really understand when you're doing this. I equal that to the long distance cycling. It's kind of like sailboat racing or mountain climbing. I mean, there's a lot going on, and you're watching mountain climbers climb Mount Everest, and they're 1 foot in front of the other for 10 days, and it looks pretty boring. But when you're hanging on the side of a cliff, it's pretty exciting. So that's what it was when I was racing across the country. I mean, you were kind of going across at a pretty good intensity, but it wasn't race pace all the time by criterium standards, but you still were dealing with stuff. You were dealing with the wind, you deal with the weather, you're dealing with the logistics. So there was this constant interaction all the time with the crew, and of course the nutrition, and you had to go as hard as possible, but you also knew you had to keep going for days and days and days. It was a kind of a balancing act about recovery and exhaustion. So you're kind of right on the edge of intensity all the time. And so over the years, as I could explain more as we got into racing more and more, we refined that skill. And I think that's a lot of the improvement came in later years. We knew where that fine edge was between recovery and exhaustion. And so it was kind of a busy time. And, there again, we didn't really know a lot what we were doing. Stuff has developed so much in the last 40 years, even like liquid nutrition and stuff. We were dabbling around with like Carnation instant breakfast as a liquid diet, milkshakes. I mean, you're just trying to get in digestible calories. So for a lot of that's it was a learning experience. And so in some ways it was really fascinating. I didn't think it was boring at all, because we were always right on the edge of having something go wrong. So we had to really concentrate.
Yeah. What were some of the tricks you'd use to recover between days? Because you said you were averaging how many miles per day?
Well, on the double transcontinental, we started off trying to say 240 a day, and eventually, I think on a return trip, I was doing 260, 275, something like that on the average. I don't think I had really many days over 300 miles, but at that point, you thought, oh, what's the definition of being tired? You ride till 10 o'clock at night and feel that you had to really put in a good day, get up at sunrise. Well, and then later years, it's like, well, you'd ride till midnight and get up at 4 in the morning and get in 4 hours of sleep. And so as we did it more and more, we knew what the limits of recovery were. I think that's why our daily averages went up. And just going back to at the end of the double transcontinental, I thought I had done everything I wanted to do. I thought my cycling career was over. Went back to Staten Island, and went to sleep in the mid-morning, got up at noon, had a press conference with a call-in. This is back in the days before there were even 900 call-in numbers. But these people had all called in. One of the guys was John Marino, whose record I had just broken. He congratulated me, and he said, "Oh, by the way, next year we're doing this race with 3 guys, Great American Bike Race. Would I want to participate?" And I said, "Oh, that's pretty neat." So I said, "Sure." So 6 hours earlier, I thought I had retired from cycling. And then at noon, it's like, "Oh, I've got a new goal for next year." And that was the start of the Great American Bike Race, which became the Race Across America. And John Marino was in it. John Howard, who was an Olympic cyclist, national champion. Michael Shermer, who had set other cross-country records and stuff. So, the type of riders who even did this kind of stuff was really limited. So the 4 of us were kind of like probably the best known at the time. And so we got invited to participate in this race, which was going to be on ABC Wide World of Sports, which was a really big deal back then because Wide World of Sports, there was only 3 TV stations, and Wide World of Sports had a huge rating every Sunday afternoon. So it was probably one of the top rated shows in the country. So to be on Wide World of Sports was like a big deal.
It's coast to coast, riding a bicycle. Hard to believe, isn't it? Coming up now, Wide World of Sports, the Great American Bike Race.
I'm Jim Lampley. In August of 1982, Diana Nyad and I traveled with 4 distance cyclists in the first Great American Bike Race. A ride through 15 states from Santa Monica to New York, expected to take about 10 days. By just past noon Mountain Time on the 3rd day, the leader, 24-year-old Lon Haldeman, was in New Mexico, with 728 miles of highways already behind him. At about this same time, John Howard was in 2nd place and was passing from Arizona into New Mexico. During the 2nd night of the race, Howard had grown much stronger on a diet of baby food, and his superior cycling skills were beginning to show up. He had made up a 40-mile deficit and caught up to 2nd place Michael Shermer. The 2 of them had ridden together for a while until Shermer had dropped off the road at 3 a.m. to go to sleep.
Anyway, that pretty much set my goals for the rest of 1982 is, getting ready for that race.
And so the first year it was called the Great American.
Great American Bike Race.
Okay.
Yeah, and that name was penned by a magazine editor who had the rights to that name. And then it was eventually trademarked by a lawyer who represented us. And then 1983, we did the race again. The lawyer didn't want us to use that name because he had it. And so that's how it became the Race Across America instead.
Got it. And that's when I discovered it, when it was RAAM, was that
Mm-hmm.
what we called it. So that's really cool. And then tell us about that, those races, how those go. I do remember John Howard was the main one I remember, in addition to you riding those. And you seem to be doing a lot of the long distance stuff as well back then.
Yeah, and he had won the Ironman triathlon. It was maybe 1980 or so, or was it 81? He won the Ironman triathlon, and that was a big deal because that was on Wide World of Sports. And so he was probably the most recognizable, endurance athlete in the country at that time. So for him to do the cross country race was a big deal.
Yeah, that's great. So what are some other, what are your, looking back, what's your favorite ride that you did?
Well, different races for, I had done 14 races, across the country. And so some were good, some weren't so good. But 1983, I ended up, 1982 was the Great American Bike Race. I ended up winning that one by, I think it was by about 12 hours or so. But it was the first time anybody had broken 10 days across the country. So that was kind of a notable thing, because if you look at it historically, there's been about, say, 800 people who have attempted the race across America, and there's been about 150 of them that broke 10 days. So, that's kind of a very good standard. If you could break 10 days across the country, that's elite of the elite. So anyway, so I broke 10 days, 9 days, 20 hours. And that was the hardest race I think I was ever in, because there was no communication between the riders, between the crews. There were no cell phones, there were no call-in time stations at payphones or anything. So you were just out there thinking you were going to get caught at any minute. I remember just being frantic almost the whole race, thinking somebody was going to catch me. I got about a 4 or 6 hour lead the first day, and I kind of built on that an hour a day or so for the rest of the race. But I still thought, even up to the last night, I'm in West Virginia, I'm still thinking somebody's going to catch me, because you didn't know where anybody was. You hear these reports, oh yeah, you're up by eight hours. And I go, well, is that, what does that mean? Is that good or is that bad? And so it wasn't until I finally got to Empire State Building in New York City that I knew the race was over and I had won, because you really didn't know. Nowadays everything is satellite tracking with trackers, and everybody can dial in on everybody and see who's on a sleep break or who's anywhere. But back then you didn't know. And so I think that was mentally, that was one of the hardest things about that race. And also you push yourself kind of, maybe I could have taken a couple sleep breaks in Indiana or Ohio and not push myself to exhaustion, because that race took me a long time to recover from. We finished in August, and it was still Thanksgiving time in late November, and my hands were still pounded, and I still had the side effects of that race. And so anyway, then ABC decided, they spent a ton of money on that. They had helicopters and all these vehicles and all this commentary. They spent a ton of money by standards of the day, and so since they spent so much money, they actually did a really good job of editing, and it won an Emmy for sports programming. And the race was shown the following February. And that race, if you still look on YouTube under Great American Bike Race, I think it's on in like a 10-part series, complete with car commercials of Ricardo Montalban selling Monte Carlo cars. But so that's a really neat overview of the United States. And so that's why it was so popular. It wasn't just bike racing. It was, it's kind of like when the Tour de France videos they're showing castles and in sunflower fields and all this as the peloton goes by. And that's really what non-cycling people wanted to see. So the Great American Bike Race encapsulated all these other things going on across the country. And so it was very popular. Well, ABC decided they're going to do it again, film it again in 1983. They did the race again. I won the race again that year. And it got really good ratings and stuff. And so, at that time, I had got married to Susan Notarangelo, and, we're still just like bike bums. We have no money. We're in a VW van. We're going around the country, doing events and stuff all winter long in the Southwest and stuff. But, so, that's why doing the race was kind of, it turned into a goal for me every year, just to get enough sponsorship to do the race again and pay for the race and get through another year. We weren't making any money. If we had $5,000 profit at the end of the year, that was like a lot of money. But that's about what I was making in the bike shop anyway. So for me, it was fine. I thought, oh, this is great. But that's what I did all through the mid 80s is, racing bikes, and Susan and I started doing these tandem transcontinentals. 1983, we did a women's tandem record, 10 days, 20 hours, which broke the men's record by a few hours. And then we did the race across America, and we did other tandem records too. Eventually in 1986, we did one in 9 days, 20 hours, cut another day off of our time. And then 1986, Pete Penseyres, who had won the Race Across America that year, 1986, he met me at the finish line. He was first, I was second. He said, "We're never doing this again. Let's do a tandem record." So Pete and I teamed up in 1987 and did a tandem transcontinental record, not against anybody else, it's just an all-out time trial across the country. And we did that in 7 days, 14 hours, which was more than a day faster than anybody else had ever across the country. And so, if I think back on good and bad experiences, I would say that even though it was the fastest time, it was not the hardest race. Things went well. I mean, a lot of things went wrong. We had broken forks and vehicle breakdowns and all that stuff that always happens. But overall, things went well. And we, to do that at almost 400 miles a day across the country, we look back on that as probably the best race we ever had, because recovery was good, sleep was good, we had the diets dialed in, equipment was the best at the time. We had a carbon fiber tandem built by Raleigh, which it all weighed 40 pounds. And nowadays you can buy a bike off the shelf, that's low 30 pounds, but at the time that was considered a lightweight bike. So but yeah, that was probably, I look back as favorite memories. That 1987 tandem ride was probably the most fun we ever had on a bike too, because we really weren't in pain. We were just enjoying ourselves as we powered across the country 22 hours a day. It was fun.
Wow, that's awesome. So what are some of the interesting dynamics that come in? I mean, that must have been fun. Like, you got someone there that's with you and sharing in the effort. What were some of the other cool parts of doing it on a tandem versus doing the solo rides?
Well, on a tandem, people say, "Oh, a tandem's faster. You should always just be faster." Well, a tandem is faster for 25 miles, maybe 100 miles. At 24 hours, you start getting into individual problems, bathroom breaks, somebody's got a sore seat, somebody's got to change their shoes. And by 2 days, everything starts falling apart. By 3 days, you're on different sleep schedules. Everybody's having their problems. So that's why tandems traditionally are slower across the country, because people get out of sync and they just have problems. And Susan and I had that problem in 1983 on the tandem record. 1986, we did it again and we eliminated some of those. That's why we went a day faster. We also did it in April, and we had freezing conditions. Continental Divide, 19 degrees, frozen water bottles. It rained and hurricane or tornadoes and stuff across the Midwest. So we're dealing with a lot of stuff in April. In hindsight, we were disappointed. We did it in 9 days, 20 hours. We thought we should have done it in 8 days, 20 hours. Well, as it turns out, that record now is held for almost 40 years. A lot of really good bike riders have tried to break it, tandem riders, and nobody's come under 10 days because stuff goes wrong. And I warn people, I say, you want to try that record, it's a durability record, because by 1,000 miles, it's not fun anymore. You're just getting all beat to heck on the back of that tandem and dealing with all the other problems of diets and, people getting sick, and one person feels great and another person feels bad. You're only going to go as fast as your slowest rider. So that's what was hard on a lot of them. But with Pete, the difference is that we kept it in sync. Amazingly, we look back on it, we only had 6 sleep breaks of 90 minutes each. So that's only 9 hours of actual sleep across the whole country. Wow. Which is pretty amazing. You can hold it together mentally and without going crazy and exhaustion and stuff. But so we broke that ride into 10-mile sections. I'd already been across that route maybe 10, 12 times on different races and stuff with Susan on her attempts and stuff too. So we broke the ride down into 10-mile sections. We said, okay, it looks like we hold 20 miles an hour. It'll be 30 minutes to do this next section. Now up ahead, we know we have a mountain to go over. I think it's going to take us 45 minutes to do the next 10 miles and so on. Then we get over the other side of the Continental Divide. Let's see if we can average 28 miles an hour and do it in 22 minutes. So we broke the ride into sections, and that's what we did over and over and over again all day long, and that kept our intensity. It wasn't just mindless plodding. And so that's the degree of focus that we needed to hold that intensity across the country.
Well, I had one logistical question. When you're doing a tandem, do you usually have one person's dedicated to the front and one to the back, or is it you switch to keep it interesting, or how do you manage? I guess that maybe people do it differently.
Right. And if you can switch between front and back, that makes a big difference. Like Susan and I did it maybe every 6 hours. We had pretty much a universal bike that was set up with quick release seat post and stem, and we could make that adjustment. During a clothing change, the crew would, all these presets in measuring sticks, and they would just, they could reset up the bike in a minute. When Pete and I did it, we actually had two different bikes, his bike, my bike, and we would start the morning after a sleep break. Say Pete would drive all day until sundown. We'd make another clothing change, get on my bike, and then I would drive, and he would be in the back, and we would go until 4 a.m. And so driving at night was harder because of concentration, but you also had a shorter shift. And then I would, I would drive till our sleep break. Well, then we'd sleep till 6 a.m. from 4 until 6. So we get up, do it again. Then I would drive starting the next shift. So then I would drive all day from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. And then we'd switch again. So Pete and I divided it almost perfectly 50%. And that gave us enough break mentally that, on the back of the tandem, as long as you focused on picking up your legs, you could actually close your eyes a little bit. You couldn't sleep because your legs would lock up, but just closing your eyes a little bit made a big difference when you were trying to, go through at night. From midnight to 4 a.m. was always the worst time. And so we really had to focus on making good time. Always had these other games we played all night long just to keep our intensity.
Wow. What were some, give me an example, one of those games you do between midnight to 4 a.m.
Yeah. Well, like I was saying about the distances, about the, concentrate on speed and things like that. We really did on heart rates, but then also even simple things like that would be our reward. And we'd have greasy baked potatoes the crew would make for us. And that was our midnight reward, is to have a greasy baked potato. Normally we're on these very strict liquid diets, so we never had really solid food, but to have a greasy baked potato in the middle of the night. And then we might have some like Ritz or little Triscuit crunchy wheat thin crackers or something, and you would eat some of that. And so just that change of texture made a big difference, and it helped, stimulate you for what good that did. But it, that's stuff that we would do in the middle of the night just to concentrate and get through the day and get through the rest of the night.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a brilliant idea. I like that. What you talk about breaking into 10 hours, because it probably just mentally, it just gives you that shorter distance to focus on. You're not trying to take in, I've got another 20 hours on the bike. You're like, I got to work my strategy to this next goal. It kind of helps keep you
right. Otherwise it gets too overwhelming, because, you go 1,000 miles in 2.5 days, and then you think, oh no, we got to do this, for another 2,000 miles. It gets kind of overwhelming. So that's why just having the shorter goals, to the next town, the next grain elevator in the distance and stuff, that helped a lot on the intensity.
What are some of the tricks to managing that sleep deprivation? I mean, that seems like the riding is so hard, but then you're just slowly having less and, how do you manage that?
Well, the good thing on the tandem is that Pete and I had this running conversation. You don't want to go anaerobic, which is the point when you're breathing really hard and you can only sustain that for several minutes. So we always we use conversation as the gauge of staying below anaerobic breathing hard. So, we just had these ongoing conversations going. And I had been over that route so many times. And, Pete tells the story about, I had a story for every town, that we went through about what happened in some previous race and what I ate that day and, where I slept. And so we had this, travel log narration that was going on throughout the whole ride. I'm sure it got a little boring to Pete sometimes, but that actually kept my focus on just concentrating on where I was and what I was doing, just thinking about, the other 10 times I'd raced across on that route.
Right. So would you feel that fatigue or were you able to, did your body adapt to the lack of sleep, or did you have tricks that helped you get,
Well, I equate it to having an internal spring that we had wound tighter and tighter and tighter over the previous 3 months, as excitement, anticipation, knowing what you were getting yourself into. And then you let that spring out a little by little. You don't let that out with an adrenaline rush the first day. You want to keep some of that adrenaline for the 6th day and the 6th night when you really need it. And so that's one of the techniques that I try to keep under control. And then also it's for me, it was always a lot of now or never in these races. Some people say, oh, they're going to try RAAM, see how it goes, and then try it again the next year. I said, if you go in it with that attitude, you're not going to make it the first year. You got to go into it thinking that's the last time you're ever going to do it, and you're going to blow yourself apart because it hurts too much to just say, oh, I'm going to go and see how I feel. Well, you're going to feel really bad at about 2 days, and you're not going to want to do it. So you got to concentrate on just saying, okay, whatever it takes. And I think the 87 tandem ride for me and Pete was going to be our last time. We had already made that decision. And so we went into it with that attitude. Well, it turned out we still did some more races after that in other years. But that's how we always went into a race, even the 82 race, even the double Transcontinental in 81. I always thought that was my last race. So when it came time in the middle of the night, can you get through it? You're like, okay, I'm never doing this again. I'm going to get through it. And that's the attitude that you had to have. That
totally makes sense. And especially for such a incredibly hard ride like that, you just, if you're trying to think, you don't have the energy. It sounds really interesting. I like that psychological energy of what you were talking about, of the anticipation of the event and how you sustain that through. That's really cool.
Yeah. And even with our tours that we do across the country, I tell people that same thing. They want to do the Northern Transcontinental or Southern or something. I say, you got to train like this is your opportunity you'll never have again. So, you're going to do that 6 months of training. You're going to do the ride. There's always 10% of the ride that ends up being really hard. And I said, you got to get through it. You'll never get a chance to do this again. You might as well enjoy it, the challenge, and get through it. And years later, a lot of people have come up to me and said they're really glad they did it and they got through it, because it's not all just Vermont bicycle tours and wine and cheese kind of touring. When you're on a cross country trip like that, 150 miles a day or so, there's going to be challenges, and so you got to be ready for that.
Yeah. So can you talk briefly about the tours that you do?
Yeah, well, after Susan and I raced, all through in the 1980s, and, by the 1990s, we actually had to figure out something else to do. And we had all this experience of, between us, almost 20 Transcontinentals of racing. So it was an easy transition into doing the tours. So we used a lot of that knowledge to come up with these routes and tours. And so we started doing, like Seattle to Boston, San Diego to Savannah, Georgia, Mexico to Canada on the Rocky Mountains, Florida to Maine on the Eastern Mountains Blue Ridge Parkway, Route 66 tours, Los Angeles to Chicago, and even regional tours, laps of the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, and the Cascade Mountains out in Oregon and Washington State, loops of Wisconsin, which is right in our backyard, loops of New York State, which is very scenic. So we did a lot of these regional tours, and like right now I'm in Arizona finishing up our 4 weeks in Arizona that we do during the month of March. And those are, 60 to 100 mile a day type of tours for a month. So and we've been doing it now for 40 years. We've done over 100 trips across the United States.
Wow.
And we have probably a veteran base of like 1,000 riders or more. So, and we have about an 80% return rate each year. So that's really helped us actually stay in business when the pandemic and all the other stuff, that recessions and stuff happened. So yeah, we've been very fortunate to be able to do this for 40 years.
That's awesome. There's a ride coming up here, the Santa Rosa Cycling Club. They, who I'm a member of, they, in addition to Red Peloton Racing Team, they put on the Wine Country Century, and then they also have an event, the Terrible 2, which is a 200-mile ride. Yeah. And I was wondering what would be your main tips to somebody who's going out to do the 200-mile Terrible 2?
Well, a basic training goal, whatever you're going to do in 24 hours, you should try to do in a week of riding for 10 weeks. So if you're going to try to do a 200 miles nonstop ride, you should be riding 200 a week for 10 weeks. And that could just be broken down into 40 and 50 mile rides. But eventually, a training hint that we do for our tours is eventually your longest day is going to be 10 miles longer than the previous week. And then you're not spending more time, more than 200 miles a week training, but then you're going to have more, you might have a couple more off the bike days you don't even ride. So eventually you're getting up, so for a double century, you're doing back-to-back 100-mile days, and then you might not ride much the rest of the week. And that brings out the problems. Most people on a 200-mile ride, and they've never done it before, they find out their saddle doesn't work and their shoes don't fit and they don't know what to eat and they bonk and they have problems. So what you're doing is you're gradually getting yourself ready. I always like simulation training. And you don't only get that when you're putting in those hours and trying to simulate that ride that you're going to do. So, a 200-mile ride in Terrible 2, and you're going to do it, whether you do it in 10 hours or 18 hours, it can still be a really long time to be on the bike. So you want to simulate that for 10 weeks ahead of time if possible.
Yeah, that's great advice. I love that. Thank you. I wonder, that makes me think of earlier you talked about how incredibly long it took you to recover from some of those transcontinental rides. That you mentioned the one ended in August and you were still feeling it around Thanksgiving. What were some of the things you were experiencing?
Well, back then, the pounding of the hands and actually losing the ability to grip the thumb muscle there at the base of the thumb would get so pounded you couldn't use your thumb anymore. And what really, people say, well, what's the biggest improvement in cycling? I would have to say aero bars, because for long distance riding, it's just be able to get in an aero position, which helped about 1 mile an hour. Your speed went from 17 to 18 miles an hour, which was a huge improvement. But also to keep the weight off your hands and stay comfortable. And so that's, for me, it was the beat up part of the hands, and when I finished the double Transcontinental in 81, I remember my shoes, because my feet were hot and sweaty for 24 days. About a week later, all the skin started peeling off the sides of anything that was in my shoe being wet and stuff. My feet were just peeling, all the calluses were just flaking off and stuff. So, that's another side effect of being, out there for 24 days.
Wow. Yeah. That's incredible. And it's like you said, it's amazing all of the things you've learned by doing so many of those incredible events like that. I wanted to hear about your book. I'm really looking forward to reading that. So yeah, tell me about how that came about and share.
Well, yeah, my dad passed away 19 about 8 years ago. And then my mom was like, you better write a book about that double transcontinental, because that was such a weird event at the time. So over the last 8 years, I've really been focused on writing that book. And my mom's 93, and she said, I better hurry up and get it done while she could still read it. So that was kind of the goal.
Great.
So the book was kind of about some of the things we talked about, as a kid starting to ride, and one thing led to another, and all the coincidences that happened along the way. So I was really lucky to be in the right place at the right time on a lot of these things, being invited to the Great American Bike Race, for example. That was a great opportunity. And so that's kind of what the book is. And it's themed about the double transcontinental, and what that led up to. But then later in the book, it gets into, after I wasn't riding as much, then I was going down and doing these tours like in Peru, in Africa, and I saw things that I could help with. And I started construction projects, building stairs for houses in the shanty towns and building bunk beds for families and stuff. And then eventually building schools and stuff in the Amazon jungle. And the same thing happened in Africa, going around and meeting different people. So as I got to meet lots and lots of people, that really made it more human for me. It wasn't just doing projects; it was actually helping people. And so I bet I get 5 emails a week from Peruvians and Ghana, Africa people, just not asking for money, but just like, yeah, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. And so for me, that was a life-changing thing too, as much as being involved in the Great American Bike Race and finishing races on Wide World of Sports and the satisfaction that gives you. That really was not as big a deal as some of the stuff we've done in Peru and Africa, and a lot of it's been done anonymously. We don't put our names on a lot of that projects we do, but that's kind of what the book is about, just how one thing could lead to another and the opportunities that come along, and to make the most out of those opportunities. So that's why we wrote the book. It was just, it wasn't a big plan. I had no plans for beyond the double transcontinental, and it turned into 40 more years of cycling, which I've been grateful for.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading that. I think that's all I had to go over. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about or just mention?
Well, no, I would just say, people want to get a hold of me or something through our company. It's PAC Tour, Pacific Atlantic Cycling Tour. I'm not sure if you can even see this, what it says here, but PAC Tour.
I'll make sure to put the information in the notes in the description.
Yeah, if you go to that website, we're putting more and more history articles on there. A lot of the stuff that I've written over the years for different cycling magazines, we're putting that in. So it's just interesting travel log reading. But then also about events coming up. We always plan about 18 months ahead of time on our schedule. And people are always asking us every day what's coming up in 2026, 2027. So we're trying to keep all of that, because the tours do fill up. We've been filling up every year for the last 20 years. So, but anyway, so that's a good way. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, you can do it through the website.
Great. Well, thanks so much. This has been really fantastic to visit with you, and especially to learn so much more from the events that are such great memories of growing up in my journey through cycling. So this has been really fantastic.
If you were there at the George Washington Bridge on the morning of August 14, 1982, you will always remember it as the most beautiful of summer mornings. Lon Haldeman had left Santa Monica, California with 3 other men on August 4. He was about to complete a 2,978-mile bicycle ride across the United States. It was the 10th day of the Great American Bicycle Race, and Haldeman was about to break his own transcontinental record by more than a full day. He was doing so riding a route slightly longer than the one he had used the year before. He had won a race, too, but somehow that didn't seem so important anymore. What was important was that in a few more minutes, Lon Haldeman would be finished with what had seemed to some of us an endless journey.
this life drifts like waves to Lord's secret shores. Yeah, this life drifts like waves